In 1999, 77-year-old Mary Bowles was simply running errands at a Tulsa shopping mall. But that day took a tragic turn. She was approached by two men, John Fitzgerald Hanson and his associate, Victor Miller. They forced her into her own car and drove her to a remote dirt pit near Owasso. There, Hanson pulled out a gun and opened fire, leaving Mary critically injured. But the situation quickly escalated. While they attempted to leave the scene unnoticed, the property owner, Gerald Thurman, unexpectedly arrived. As he confronted the two men, Miller reacted by pulling the trigger as well. Thurman sustained life-threatening injuries and passed away 2 weeks later at the hospital. Hanson was soon taken into custody and charged with 2 counts, one for the intentional act that ended Mary's life, and another tied to Thurman's tragic passing during the commission of a felony. The jury weighed all the evidence, including Hanson's prior history of violence, and decided he should receive the most serious penalty under Oklahoma law. He was sentenced to capital punishment in 2001. However, Hanson was not immediately transferred to death row. For years he remained in a federal facility in Louisiana due to an unrelated bank robbery conviction. It wasn't until early 2025 that the federal government allowed his return to Oklahoma custody. Once he was back, the state moved quickly. His execution date was scheduled without delay. Hanson's legal team made a final attempt to intervene. They argued that he had autism and was vulnerable to influence by Miller, who had received a life sentence without parole. Despite this, the Oklahoma Pardon and Parole Board voted 3-2 against granting clemency. Now the final chapter is nearing. John Fitzgerald Hanson is scheduled to be executed by lethal injection on June 12, 2025, at the Oklahoma State Penitentiary. Raymond Eugene Johnson on June 22, 2007. Flames lit up the night sky in Tulsa, Oklahoma. A house was on fire, and when emergency crews arrived, they found something even worse inside. 2 bodies. One of them was 24-year-old Brooke Whitaker. The other was her 7-month-old daughter, KYA. At first it looked like a tragic accident, but the truth was far darker. Investigators discovered Brooke had been beaten to death with a hammer before the fire was set. The baby girl had died from smoke inhalation. This wasn't a fire, it was a cover-up. And the killer was someone Brooke once trusted. Her ex-boyfriend, Raymond Eugene Johnson, was out on parole at the time. He'd already served part of a 20-year sentence for a different killing in 1995. Now he was back, and this time it was even more brutal. Johnson and Brooke had recently reconnected, but their relationship turned violent. In the days before her death, she told friends she was scared of him. She even got a protective order. But it wasn't enough. The night of the murders, Johnson went to her house, attacked her with a hammer, and then lit the place on fire with her and the baby still inside. He left them to burn. He was arrested shortly after. The case moved fast. At trial, prosecutors laid out the timeline, the autopsy reports, the history of domestic violence. The jury didn't take long to convict him on 2 counts of first-degree murder. They said he deserved death. In 2009, a judge made it official. Johnson was sentenced to die by lethal injection. For years, his lawyers filed appeal after appeal, arguing mental illness, poor representation, anything they could. But the courts denied him. By 2025, Raymond Johnson is still on death row at the Oklahoma State Penitentiary. His appeals have run dry. State officials have named him as one of the inmates expected to receive an execution date soon. If that happens, it'll bring closure to a case that shook Oklahoma. A man with a deadly past who was given a second chance, only to take the lives of a young mother and her baby in one of the state's most horrifying double murders. Alton Alexander Nolan, September 25, 2014. Just after lunch break at Vaughn Foods in Moore, Oklahoma, the building erupted into chaos. A man had stormed in with a knife. By the time police arrived, one woman was dead. Another was clinging to life. The attacker was 30-year-old Alton Alexander Nolan, a former employee who'd just been suspended earlier that day. Nolan walked through the building, found 54-year-old Colleen Hufford, and slit her throat from ear to ear, nearly decapitating her. Then he moved on to 43-year-old Tracy Johnson and stabbed her multiple times. He didn't stop until the company's COO, who also happened to be a reserve deputy, shot him. Nolan survived, but what shocked Oklahoma and the country was the motive. He'd recently converted to Islam and started ranting about jihad, the Taliban, and beheadings. He praised violent extremists on social media. He even said his attack was inspired by his faith. But the story didn't end there. His defense attorneys claimed he was insane. Multiple psychiatrists diagnosed him with schizophrenia. They said he believed he was acting on orders from God. During his trial, he shouted in court, cursed jurors, and showed no remorse. But prosecutors argued he knew what he was doing. They said this was workplace revenge mixed with extremist ideology. The jury agreed. In 2017, Nolan was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to death. The judge called the attack cold-blooded. Jurors said the brutal nature of the killing, the lack of remorse, and the danger he posed to others left them no choice. Since then, Nolan's appeals have all been rejected. Courts ruled he was competent to stand trial and competent to be executed. By 2025, Alton Nolan remains on Oklahoma's death row. James Chandler Ryder, in 1999, a quiet corner of Pittsburgh County, Oklahoma, became the backdrop for a chilling crime. James Chandler Ryder, once a trusted neighbor, committed an act that would haunt the community for decades. Ryder had lived on the property of 70-year-old Daisy Hallam and her 38-year-old son Sam in 1998. He helped care for their home and horses when they were away, but after a dispute over some of his belongings, Ryder moved out. On February 28, 1999, Ryder returned to the Hallam residence. Armed with a hatchet and a shotgun, he attacked both Daisy and Sam. Daisy suffered blunt force injuries, and Sam was shot during the incident. After the violence, Ryder set the house on fire and fled the scene. Investigators quickly identified Ryder as the suspect. He was arrested and charged with 2 counts of unlawful homicide. In 2000, he was convicted and sentenced to death for Daisy's case, and received life without parole for Sam's. Over the years, Ryder's mental health declined sharply. He was diagnosed with schizophrenia and began showing signs of delusional thinking. He believed his execution would only destroy his physical form, not his soul. He also made bizarre claims, like being the only heterosexual male on Earth and needing to raise a child in Russia. In December 2023, the Oklahoma Court of Criminal Appeals issued a 100-day stay of execution to examine Ryder's mental state. By March 2024, Judge Michael Hogan ruled that Ryder was not mentally competent to face execution. The court found he could not rationally grasp the reality or reason for his sentence. As of now, Ryder remains on death row, but any execution is paused indefinitely. The state may try to restore his competency, but he is currently under the joint supervision of the Department of Corrections and the Department of Mental Health and Substance Abuse Services. For the Hallam family, time hasn't dulled the pain. They lost both a mother and a son in one night, and while the legal battle continues, the emotional toll remains heavy. Wade Greely Lay has spent nearly 2 decades on Oklahoma's death row after being convicted of murdering a bank security guard during a failed robbery. On the morning of May 24, 2004, Wade and his 19-year-old son Christopher Lay walked into the Mid-First Bank in Tulsa. Both were armed. Their goal was to rob the bank, claiming later it was part of a plan to fund what Wade described as a revolution against the federal government. Inside the bank, things quickly escalated. Kenneth Anderson, a 36-year-old security guard and retired police officer, confronted the 2 men. A shootout followed, and Anderson was fatally shot by Wade. The robbery failed. The Lays fled the scene but were captured soon after. Investigators recovered weapons, documents, and recordings that revealed Wade's extreme anti-government beliefs. At trial, prosecutors portrayed Wade Lay as the mastermind behind the robbery and shooting, driven by personal ideology. The jury was shown evidence of how he trained his son to take part in the crime. Christopher, though armed, did not fire his weapon during the incident. He was later sentenced to life in prison, without the possibility of parole. Wade was found guilty of first-degree murder and attempted robbery. In 2005, a jury sentenced him to death. During sentencing, the court heard from witnesses and mental health professionals. Although his defense raised concerns about Wade's mental state, the court ruled that he was competent to stand trial. But in the years that followed, his legal team continued to argue that Wade suffered from delusions and was not fully aware of the consequences of his actions. In 2024, that argument gained traction. A state judge reviewed new psychological evaluations and ruled that Wade Lay was not mentally competent to be executed. Experts testified that he did not have a rational understanding of why he was facing the death penalty. As a result, his execution was postponed indefinitely. As of now, he remains on death row at the Oklahoma State Penitentiary, with no execution date set. TREMANE TREMANE was just 22 years old when his life and someone else's changed forever. Back in 2002, TREMANE and his older brother Jake Wood planned to rob a man named Ronnie Whipp in Oklahoma City. The two brothers didn't go in with the intent to take a life, but things went wrong. During the robbery, Jake pulled out a gun and shot Ronnie Whipp. Ronnie died from his injuries. He was only 22 years old, same age as TREMANE. Here's where the story gets complicated. TREMANE didn't pull the trigger, but because he took part in the robbery, Oklahoma law still held him responsible for the death. It's called the felony murder rule. That means if someone dies during a crime like robbery, everyone involved can be charged with murder, even if they didn't fire a weapon. Police arrested both brothers. Jake confessed to the shooting. He admitted he was the one who caused the death. Still, in court he got a life sentence. TREMANE got sentenced to death. A lot of people found that strange. Why would the one who pulled the trigger get life, and the one who didn't get the death penalty? It gets even more troubling when you look at TREMANE's legal defense. His court-appointed lawyer was overloaded with cases, nearly 100 at once. That same lawyer also had a record of substance abuse, and had been arrested not long after TREMANE's trial. Some people believe that the lawyer wasn't capable of giving TREMANE a fair defense. At trial, the jury never heard about TREMANE's childhood. He grew up around violence and poverty. He had no stable home life, and few chances to escape the cycle he was born into. He also had no history of violence before this crime. But none of that was brought up in court. In 2004, TREMANE was sentenced to die. He was sent to Oklahoma State Penitentiary, where he remains today, over 20 years later. He's filed appeals claiming he didn't get a fair trial and that he wasn't the killer. So far, every appeal has been denied. He waits on death row. No execution date has been set. William Lewis Reece. In the summer of 1997, something strange started happening across Texas and Oklahoma. Young women were going missing, one by one. No clear suspect, no warning, and no clue what tied the cases together. At the center of it all was a man named William Lewis Reece. He had just gotten out of prison in Texas for a kidnapping charge. Not long after that, the disappearances began. In April, 12-year-old Laura Smither went out for a jog near her home in Friendswood. She never made it back. Her body was found in a drainage area 17 days later. A few months after that, 17-year-old Jessica Kane left a local diner and vanished. Then 20-year-old Kelly Cox disappeared after leaving a college class in Denton. Each time there were no signs of a struggle, just missing persons reports and families left in the dark. Then came July. Reece traveled north to Bethany, Oklahoma, where 19-year-old Tiffany Johnston was last seen at a car wash. She was reported missing that same day. Her body was discovered the next morning in a nearby field. Police worked the case for years, but the trail kept going cold. It wasn't until 2015 that investigators got the break they needed. A DNA test from Tiffany Johnston's case came back with a match: William Lewis Reece. At the time, Reece was already in a Texas prison on an unrelated charge. Once the connection was made, things started coming together. During interviews, Reece began talking. He eventually led police to two separate burial sites in rural Texas. There, they found the remains of Jessica Kane and Kelly Cox. Reece also admitted to involvement in Laura Smither's case. Although Texas had enough to charge him, Oklahoma moved first. In 2021, Reece went on trial for the murder of Tiffany Johnston. The prosecution presented the DNA results, his statements, and the pattern behind the cases. Reece sat quietly in court. When the verdict came, the jury found him guilty and recommended a sentence of death. As of 2025, William Lewis Reece is on death row at the Oklahoma State Penitentiary. He has filed appeals, but so far the sentence remains in place. David Anthony Ware, on the morning of June 29, 2020, Tulsa, Oklahoma, witnessed one of its most devastating police encounters in recent history. Around 3 a.m., 32-year-old David Anthony Ware was pulled over by two officers for a routine traffic stop. What started as a normal check turned into something far worse. Sergeant Craig Johnson and Officer Arash Zarkshan approached Ware's vehicle. They suspected he was under the influence and found drugs and a loaded weapon. As the stop escalated, the officers tried to detain Ware. Body cam footage later revealed that he resisted, first verbally, then physically. After being pepper sprayed and tased, Ware reached under his seat and pulled out a gun. In seconds, everything changed. Ware fired multiple rounds, hitting both officers at close range. Sergeant Johnson was struck in the head and torso. Officer Zarkshan was hit several times but managed to crawl to safety. Ware fled the scene, sparking a citywide manhunt. He was arrested later that day after hiding out at a friend's home. Sergeant Johnson died from his injuries the next morning. He was a father, husband, and a 15-year veteran of the Tulsa Police Department. Officer Zarkshan survived but faced a long, painful recovery. Prosecutors charged Ware with first-degree murder, shooting with intent to kill, and multiple felonies tied to drugs and illegal weapons. At trial, the evidence was overwhelming. Dashcam footage, body cam recordings, and forensic matches told the whole story. Ware's defense claimed excessive force was used, but the jury didn't agree. In 2022, David Ware was found guilty on all major counts. The court sentenced him to death for the murder of Sergeant Johnson. Appeals are still ongoing, but as of 2025, he remains on death row at the Oklahoma State Penitentiary. This case hit the Tulsa community hard. It wasn't just about one violent moment. It was about how quickly a tense situation can explode into tragedy. Two officers were taken down doing their job, and one never came home. Carlos Cuesta Rodriguez said, Carlos was born in Cuba and came to the United States during the Mariel boat lift in 1980. By 2003, he was living in Oklahoma City with his common-law wife, 44-year-old Olympia Fisher, and her adult daughter. Their home wasn't peaceful. Carlos was jealous, controlling, and angry most of the time. On the night of May 31, 2003, everything exploded. Carlos had been drinking. He was convinced Olympia was cheating on him. That night he wrote a note full of disturbing thoughts and waited for her to come home. When Olympia walked through the door, they started fighting. Carlos pulled a gun and shot her, straight in the face. She didn't die right away. She was still breathing when paramedics showed up, but she was brain dead. Doctors said there was no chance of recovery. Her daughter had to make the call to take her off life support. Olympia died a few days later. Police arrested Carlos at the house. He didn't resist. He told officers it was an accident. He said the gun went off by mistake, but the evidence said otherwise. Investigators found signs of a planned attack. The note he wrote, the angle of the shot, it all pointed to murder. At trial, the jury heard about the rocky relationship. They saw photos from the scene. They read the note. They heard how Carlos once held a knife to Olympia's throat during another fight. The prosecution argued he was dangerous and full of rage. The defense tried to say he was depressed and didn't mean to kill her. It didn't work. Carlos Cuesta Rodriguez was found guilty of first-degree murder. The jury called it especially heinous, atrocious, and cruel. They said he posed a continuing threat. He was sentenced to death. Carlos has spent over 2 decades on Oklahoma's death row. He's filed appeal after appeal, trying to get his sentence overturned. He's blamed bad lawyers, bad jury instructions, even asked the U.S. Supreme Court to hear his case, but every court said no. In early 2024, the state scheduled his execution for June 6. He was set to die by lethal injection. But just weeks before, Oklahoma's Attorney General asked for a delay. The state didn't have enough time or staff to carry out the execution properly. So Carlos got a temporary stay. As of 2025, he's still sitting on death row, waiting for a new date. This case shows how jealousy and rage can turn deadly. A woman is gone, a daughter lost her mother, and a family was destroyed. Clarence Goode Jr. on August 25, 2005, a brutal triple homicide shook the small town of Owasso, Oklahoma, when Clarence Goode Jr., along with two co-defendants, Ronald Thompson and Kenneth Johnson, was accused of murdering Mitch Thompson, his wife Tara Burchett Thompson, and their 10-year-old daughter, Kayla. The victims were shot multiple times inside their home, and the crime was immediately labeled especially heinous and cruel. The prosecution's case focused on a long-standing feud between Clarence Goode Jr. and Mitch Thompson, which grew even more tense because Goode was dating Mitch's sister, Michelle. The tension escalated after a car accident and a series of heated altercations between the families, leading the state to argue that Goode's anger and involvement in this family dispute directly caused the tragic murders. Goode was charged with 3 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of first-degree burglary. At his trial in 2008, the jury heard extensive testimony linking him to the crime scene, and despite his defense team's attempts to cast doubt on the evidence and his role, he was convicted and sentenced to death. While Goode was given the death penalty, his co-defendants received convictions as well, but their sentences varied. Since his conviction, Goode's legal team has fought tirelessly through the appeals process, arguing that he received ineffective assistance of counsel and that prosecutorial misconduct tainted his trial. However, despite these efforts, multiple courts, including the U.S. Supreme Court, declined to overturn his sentence or even review his case, with the highest court denying certiorari in 2020. In 2024, Clarence Goode Jr. was scheduled for execution on August 8, but his execution was stayed and postponed to a later date, so as of 2025, he remains on death row at the Oklahoma State Penitentiary, waiting for his fate to be decided. Alfred Brian Mitchell, on July 22, 1991, in Tulsa, Oklahoma, 24-year-old Alfred Brian Mitchell made a choice that would change 2 lives forever, his own, and that of a young woman named Peggy Casey. Peggy was 24 years old, a student at Oral Roberts University, and working a summer job at a church camp. She had just finished cleaning up after dinner when she returned to her dorm, not knowing someone was watching. According to court records, Mitchell followed Peggy into her dorm room and attacked her. She tried to fight him off, but the struggle ended with Peggy being assaulted and killed. She was found the next morning by camp staff, and the scene shocked everyone who knew her. Peggy was well liked, known for her kindness and devotion to her faith. The crime left her family, church and school in mourning. Mitchell was arrested soon after, thanks to fingerprints found at the scene and items that linked him to the crime. At the time, he was already on probation for robbery and burglary. When questioned by police, Mitchell gave inconsistent stories, but DNA evidence eventually tied him directly to the assault. Prosecutors said the crime was especially cruel due to the nature of the attack, and the fact that Peggy was left without help. At trial, the state presented forensic evidence, testimony from investigators, and details about Mitchell's criminal history. The jury found him guilty of first-degree murder, and he was sentenced to death. His defense attorneys argued he had mental health struggles and a rough upbringing, but those arguments weren't enough to change the outcome. The jury believed the crime showed a pattern of dangerous behavior. Over the years, Mitchell has filed multiple appeals. His legal team claimed that his defense at trial was inadequate and that some jury instructions were flawed. But higher courts, including the U.S. Supreme Court, have refused to overturn the conviction. In 2000, the 10th Circuit Court of Appeals upheld his death sentence. As of 2025, Alfred Brian Mitchell remains on death row at the Oklahoma State Penitentiary. No execution date has been set, but his legal options are running out. The state still lists him as eligible for execution once a new date is scheduled. Peggy Casey's family continues to honor her memory. Friends say she had dreams of helping others through ministry and education. Her life was cut short, but her story remains part of the reason Mitchell was held accountable. Marlon Harmon. On July 1, 2004, a quiet Oklahoma City motel became the scene of a deadly robbery gone wrong. That night, 55-year-old motel clerk, Kamal Uddin Chowdhury, was working a late shift at the Economy Inn when Marlon Harmon, a 23-year-old parolee, walked in with a gun and a plan. Harmon had been released from prison just 2 months earlier. He was on parole for burglary and already back to breaking the law. Surveillance footage showed him entering the motel lobby just after midnight, pretending to ask for a room. He had a .22 caliber pistol hidden in his pocket. Inside the office, Harmon pulled the gun and demanded money. Chowdhury handed over cash from the register, but Harmon didn't stop there. In a matter of seconds, he shot Chowdhury once in the chest at point-blank range. Then he ran out the door and vanished into the night. Police arrived minutes later to find Chowdhury bleeding behind the desk. He was rushed to the hospital, but it was too late. The bullet had pierced his heart. The investigation moved quickly. Detectives reviewed motel security footage and recognized Harmon, who had a long record and was already under supervision. Witnesses told police he'd been bragging about committing a robbery. They tracked him down just days later and arrested him. At trial, prosecutors laid out a straightforward but brutal case. Harmon committed murder during a robbery, a crime that qualifies for the death penalty in Oklahoma. They showed how Harmon had planned the crime, shot an unarmed man who had already complied, and fled the scene with no regard for human life. The defense tried to argue that Harmon never meant to kill anyone, that the gun just went off during a scuffle, but the jury didn't buy it. The evidence was too strong, and the crime too violent. In 2005, Marlon Harmon was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to death. The jury found that the murder was especially cruel because it happened during a robbery and involved an unarmed compliant victim. They also considered Harmon's prior record and the fact that he'd just been released from prison. Since then, Harmon has remained on Oklahoma's death row. His legal team has filed appeals over the years, arguing that his original trial counsel was ineffective and that new evidence might change the outcome. So far, none of the appeals have overturned his conviction or sentence. In 2024, the state of Oklahoma scheduled Harmon's execution, but it was later stayed. As of 2025, he remains at the Oklahoma State Penitentiary, awaiting a new date to be set. Richard Glossip. Richard Glossip's case is one of the most debated and controversial in Oklahoma's death row history. His story began in 1997 when Barry Van Treese, a motel owner in Oklahoma City, was found murdered. Van Treese had been bludgeoned to death with a baseball bat, and the brutal nature of the crime shocked the local community. Glossip was accused of masterminding the murder, even though he did not physically commit the act. According to the prosecution, Glossip hired Justin Sneed, a handyman working at the motel, to kill Van Treese. Sneed testified against Glossip in exchange for a plea deal, claiming that Glossip wanted the motel owner dead because of a debt dispute. Despite the lack of physical evidence directly linking Glossip to the murder, the jury convicted him in 1998, based primarily on Sneed's testimony. The conviction raised serious questions because the prosecution's key witness was the person who actually committed the murder, and Glossip maintained his innocence throughout the trial and afterward. Over the years, Glossip's case has become a focal point for death penalty opponents and legal activists who argue that he was wrongfully convicted. There have been multiple appeals, new evidence attempts, and calls for DNA testing to prove his innocence. Yet the courts have consistently upheld the conviction, and Glossip remains on death row. In 2015, a new twist emerged when the man who actually killed Van Treese, Justin Sneed, confessed to acting alone and claimed Glossip was innocent. This confession led to stays of execution and renewed public debate, but no exoneration has been granted. As of 2025, Richard Glossip remains on death row at the Oklahoma State Penitentiary, awaiting a final resolution. His case highlights many complexities in the justice system, including reliance on eyewitness testimony, plea bargains, and the challenges in proving innocence after conviction. Emmanuel Littlejohn, executed in Oklahoma in the summer of 1992, a robbery turned deadly at an Oklahoma City convenience store. Behind the counter that night was 31-year-old Kenneth Mears. He had no idea he was about to lose his life. Two men walked in, Emmanuel Littlejohn and Glenn Bethany. What happened next would put one of them on death row. Littlejohn and Bethany were after money. They had a gun and a plan. But something went wrong. Kenneth Mears ended up shot in the back of the head. No one else was in the store. No security cameras. Just a dead man and a lot of questions. When police arrived, the scene was brutal. Mears had been forced to his knees and executed. Within days, investigators tracked down the suspects. Both Littlejohn and Bethany were arrested and charged with first-degree murder. But here's where things got complicated. Both men blamed each other. Each said the other pulled the trigger. There was no physical evidence proving who fired the gun, no eyewitnesses, no video, just two suspects pointing fingers. At trial, Glenn Bethany got life without parole. But for Emmanuel Littlejohn, the jury chose death. Why? Prosecutors argued that Littlejohn was the one who actually shot Mears. They said he planned the whole thing. The jury believed them. Littlejohn spent over 30 years on Oklahoma's death row. During that time, he kept saying the same thing: he didn't kill Kenneth Mears. He admitted to the robbery but said Bethany was the shooter. He said he didn't deserve to die for something he didn't do. Lawyers fought hard to stop his execution. They said the jury never got to hear key facts. They pointed to Littlejohn's clean record behind bars. No violence, no problems. Even some of the victims' family members asked the governor to give him life instead. In August 2024, the Oklahoma Pardon and Parole Board voted 3-2 in favor of clemency. It was rare, but Governor Kevin Stitt said no. He said the courts had spoken and the execution would go forward. On September 26, 2024, Emmanuel Littlejohn was put to death by lethal injection. His last words were a prayer. He said he forgave everyone and hoped for peace, especially when the victims are young and vulnerable. Execution. Derrick Don Posey. Derrick Don Posey. Derrick Don Posey. Case dates back to 2002 in Oklahoma, where he was convicted of a violent and tragic crime that shook the local community. Posey was found guilty of the murder of 27-year-old Melissa Jennings, a crime that involved kidnapping and brutal violence. The nature of the offense and the evidence presented led prosecutors to seek the death penalty. According to the investigation, Posey abducted Melissa Jennings from her home and subjected her to a violent assault. The attack escalated to murder, and Melissa's body was discovered several days later in a remote area outside the city. The crime scene and forensic evidence played a critical role in linking Posey to the offense, helping law enforcement piece together the events that led to the tragic death. Police quickly focused on Posey as a suspect based on witness statements and forensic data such as DNA and fingerprints found at the scene. Once arrested, he was charged with first-degree murder, kidnapping, and other related offenses. The evidence against him was substantial and included physical proof and eyewitness accounts. During the trial, the prosecution presented a strong case, combining forensic evidence with witness testimony to demonstrate Posey's guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. The defense team tried to challenge the evidence by suggesting alternative explanations and questioning the reliability of witnesses, but these arguments failed to convince the jury. In 2003, Derrick Don Posey was convicted and sentenced to death. Since then, he has remained on death row at the Oklahoma State Penitentiary. His attorneys have filed multiple appeals over the years, focusing on issues such as trial fairness and evidence handling. However, none of these appeals have resulted in overturning the conviction or altering the sentence. As of 2025, Posey continues to await execution, highlighting the lengthy legal processes that often follow capital convictions. His case serves as an example of how the justice system deals with violent offenders and the challenges involved in securing and maintaining a death sentence. Thank you for watching. This video was created purely for educational purposes to provide a clear understanding of these criminal cases and how the justice system processes severe offenses. If you found this information valuable, please consider subscribing and hitting the notification bell to stay updated on more true crime content. Stay safe and informed.